Chapter 2. I had Tio put down the shopping bag. Tio opened the lock on the gate. It was a simple padlock and any child could have broken it, but on the gate was a sign saying private no trespassing, and no one could go past that. Our father had put up the signs in the gates and the locks when he closed off the path. Before, everyone used the path as a shortcut from the village to the highway 4 corners where the bus stopped. It saved them perhaps a quarter of a mile to use our path and walk past our front door. Our mother disliked the sight of anyone who wanted to walking past our front door, and when our father brought her to live in the Blackwood house, one of the first things he had to do was close off the path and fence in the entire Blackwood property, from the highway to the creek. There was another gate at the other end of the path, although I rarely went that way, and that gate too had a padlock and a sign saying private no trespassing. The highway's built for common people, our mother said, and my front door is private. Anyone who came to see us, properly invited, came up the main drive, which led straight from the gate posts on the highway up to our front door. When I was small, I used to lie in my bedroom at the back of the house and imagine the driveway and the path as a crossroad meeting before our front door, and up and down the driveway went the good people, the clean and rich ones dressed in satin and lace, who came rightfully to visit, and back and forth along the path, sneaking and weaving and sidestepping servilely, went the people from the village. They can't get in, I used to tell myself over and over, lying in my dark room with the trees patterned in shadow on the ceiling. They can't ever get in anymore, the path is closed forever. Sometimes I stood inside the fence, hidden by the bushes, and watched people walking on the highway to get from the village to the 4 corners. As far as I knew, no one from the village had ever tried to use the path since our father locked the gates. When I had moved the shopping bag inside, I carefully locked the gate again, and tested the padlock to make sure it held. Once the padlock was securely fastened behind me, I was safe. The path was dark, because once our father had given up any idea of putting his land to profitable use, he had let the trees and bushes and small flowers grow as they chose, and except for one great meadow and the gardens our land was heavily wooded, and no one knew its secret ways but me. When I went along the path, going easily now, because I was home, I knew each step and every turn. Constance could put names to all the growing things, but I was content to know them by their way and place of growing, and their unfailing offers of refuge. The only prints on the path were my own, going in and out to the village. Past the turn, I might find a mark of Constance's foot, because she sometimes came that far to wait for me, but most of Constance's prints were in the garden and in the house. Today she had come to the end of the garden, and I saw her as soon as I came around the turn. She was standing with the house behind her, in the sunlight, and I ran to meet her. "Merricat," she said, smiling at me, "look how far I came today." "It's too far," I said. "First thing I know you'll be following me into the village." "I might, at that," she said. Even though I knew she was teasing me, I was chilled, but I laughed. "You wouldn't like it much," I told her. "Here, lazy, take some of these packages." "Where's my cat?" "He went off chasing butterflies, because you were late." "Did you remember eggs?" "I forgot to tell you." "Of course. Let's have lunch on the lawn." When I was small, I thought Constance was a fairy princess. I used to try to draw her picture, with long golden hair and eyes as blue as the crayon could make them, and a bright pink spot on either cheek. The pictures always surprised me, because she did look like that. Even at the worst time she was pink and white and golden, and nothing had ever seemed to dim the brightness of her. She was the most precious person in my world, always. I followed her across the soft grass, past the flowers she tended, into our house, and Jonas, my cat, came out of the flowers and followed me. Constance waited inside the tall front door while I came up the steps behind her, and then I put my packages down on the table in the hall and locked the door. We would not use it again until afternoon, because almost all of our life was lived toward the back of the house, on the lawn and the garden where no one else ever came. We left the front of the house turned toward the highway and the village, and went our own ways behind its stern, unwelcoming face. Although we kept the house well, the rooms we used together were the back ones, the kitchen and the back bedrooms and the little warm room off the kitchen where Uncle Julian lived. Outside was Constance's chestnut tree and the wide, lovely reach of lawn and Constance's flowers, and then, beyond, the vegetable garden Constance tended, and, past that, the trees which shaded the creek. When we sat on the back lawn, no one could see us from anywhere. I remembered that I was to be kinder to Uncle Julian when I saw him sitting at his great old desk in the kitchen corner, playing with his papers. Will you let Uncle Julian have peanut brittle? I asked Constance. After his lunch, Constance said. She took the groceries carefully from the bags. Food of any kind was precious to Constance, and she always touched foodstuffs with quiet respect. I was not allowed to help. I was not allowed to prepare food, nor was I allowed to gather mushrooms, although I sometimes carried vegetables in from the garden, or apples from the old trees. We'll have muffins, Constance said, almost singing, because she was sorting and putting away the food. Uncle Julian will have an egg, done soft and buttery, and a muffin and a little pudding. Pap, said Uncle Julian. Merricat will have something lean and rich and salty. Jonas will catch me a mouse, I said to my cat on my knee. I'm always so happy when you come home from the village, Constance said. She stopped to look and smile at me. Partly because you bring home food, of course. But partly because I miss you. I'm always happy to get home from the village, I told her. Was it very bad? She touched my cheek quickly with one finger. You don't want to know about it. Someday I'll go. It was the second time she had spoken of going outside, and I was chilled. Constance, Uncle Julian said. He lifted a small scrap of paper from his desk and studied it, frowning. I do not seem to have any information on whether your father took his cigar in the garden as usual that morning. I'm sure he did, Constance said. That cat's been fishing in the creek, she told me. He came in all mud. She folded the grocery bag and put it with the others in the drawer, and set the library books on the shelf where they were going to stay forever. Jonas and I were expected to stay in our corner, out of the way, while Constance worked in the kitchen, and it was a joy to watch her, moving beautifully in the sunlight, touching food so softly. It's Helen Clark's day, I said. Are you frightened? She turned to smile at me. Not a bit, she said. I'm getting better all the time, I think. And today I'm going to make little rum cakes. And Helen Clark will scream and gobble them. Even now, Constance and I still saw some small society, visiting acquaintances who drove up the driveway to call. Helen Clark took her tea with us on Fridays, and Mrs. Shepherd or Mrs. Rice or old Mrs. Crowley stopped by occasionally on a Sunday after church to tell us we would have enjoyed the sermon. They came dutifully, although we never returned their calls, and stayed a proper few minutes and sometimes brought flowers from their gardens, or books, or a song that Constance might care to try over on her harp. They spoke politely and with little runs of laughter, and never failed to invite us to their houses although they knew we would never come. They were civil to Uncle Julian, and patient with his talk. They offered to take us for drives in their cars. They referred to themselves as our friends. Constance and I always spoke well of them to each other, because they believed that their visits brought us pleasure. They never walked on the path. If Constance offered them a cutting from a rosebush, or invited them to see a happy new arrangement of colors, they went into the garden, but they never offered to step beyond their defined areas. They walked along the garden and got into their cars by the front door and drove away down the driveway and out through the big gates. Several times Mr. and Mrs. Carrington had come to see how we were getting along, because Mr. Carrington had been a very good friend of our father's. They never came inside or took any refreshment, but they drove to the front steps and sat in their car and talked for a few minutes. How are you getting along? They always asked, looking from Constance to me and back. How are you managing all by yourselves? Is there anything you need, anything we can do? How are you getting along? Constance always invited them in, because we had been brought up to believe that it was discourteous to keep guests talking outside, but the Carringtons never came into the house. I wonder, I said, thinking about them, whether the Carringtons would bring me a horse if I asked them. I could ride it in the long meadow. Constance turned and looked at me for a minute, frowning a little. You will not ask them, she said at last. We do not ask from anyone. Remember that. I was teasing, I said, and she smiled again. I really only want a winged horse, anyway. We could fly you to the moon and back, my horse and I. I remember when you used to want a griffin, she said. Now, Miss Idleness, run out and set the table. They quarreled hatefully that last night, Uncle Julian said. I won't have it, she said. I won't stand for it, John Blackwood, and we have no choice, he said. I listened at the door, of course, but I came too late to hear what they quarreled about. I suppose it was money. They didn't often quarrel, Constance said. They were almost invariably civil to one another, niece, if that is what you mean by not quarreling, a most unsatisfactory example for the rest of us. My wife and I preferred to shout. It hardly seems like 6 years, sometimes, Constance said. I took the yellow tablecloth and went outside to the lawn to start the table. Behind me, I heard her saying to Uncle Julian, sometimes I feel I would give anything to have them all back again. When I was a child, I used to believe that someday I would grow up and be tall enough to touch the tops of the windows in our mother's drawing room. They were summer windows, because the house was really intended to be only a summer house, and our father had only put in a heating system because there was no other house for our family to move to in the winters. By rights we should have had the Rochester house in the village, but that was long lost to us. The windows in the drawing room of our house reached from the floor to the ceiling, and I could never touch the top. Our mother used to tell visitors that the light blue silk drapes on the windows had been made up 14 feet long. There were 2 tall windows in the drawing room and 2 tall windows in the dining room across the hall, and from the outside they looked narrow and thin and gave the house a gaunt high look. Inside, however, the drawing room was lovely. Our mother had brought golden-legged chairs from the Rochester house, and her harp was here, and the room shone in reflections from mirrors and sparkling glass. Constance and I only used the room when Helen Clark came for tea, but we kept it perfectly. Constance stood on a stepladder to wash the tops of the windows, and we dusted the Dresden figurines on the mantel, and with a cloth on the end of a broom I went around the wedding cake trim at the tops of the walls, staring up into the white fruit and leaves, brushing away at cupids and ribbon knots, dizzy always from looking up and walking backward, and laughing at Constance when she caught me. We polished the floors and mended tiny tears in the rose brocade on the sofas and chairs. There was a golden valance over each high window, and golden scrollwork around the fireplace, and our mother's portrait hung in the drawing room. I cannot bear to see my lovely room untidy, our mother used to say, and so Constance and I had never been allowed in here, but now we kept it shining and silky. Our mother had always served tea to her friends from a low table at one side of the fireplace, so that was where Constance always set her table. She sat on the rose sofa with our mother's portrait looking down on her, and I sat in my small chair in the corner and watched. I was allowed to carry cups and saucers and pass sandwiches and cakes, but not to pour tea. I disliked eating anything while people were looking at me, so I had my tea afterwards, in the kitchen. That day, which was the last time Helen Clark ever came for tea, Constance had set the table as usual, with the lovely thin rose-colored cups our mother had always used, and 2 silver dishes, one with small sandwiches and one with the very special rum cakes. 2 rum cakes were waiting for me in the kitchen, in case Helen Clark ate all of these. Constance sat quietly on the sofa, she never fidgeted, and her hands were neatly in her lap. I waited by the window, watching for Helen Clark, who was always precisely on time. "Are you frightened?" I asked Constance once, and she said, "No, not at all." Without turning, I could hear from her voice that she was quiet. I saw the car turn into the driveway and then saw that there were 2 people in it instead of 1. "Constance," I said, "she's brought someone else." Constance was still for a minute, and then she said quite firmly, "I think it will be all right." I turned to look at her, and she was quiet. "I'll send them away," I said. "She knows better than this." "No," Constance said. "I really think it will be all right. You watch me. But I won't have you frightened. Sooner or later," she said, "sooner or later I will have to take a first step." I was chilled. "I want to send them away." "No," Constance said. "Absolutely not." The car stopped in front of the house, and I went into the hall to open the front door, which I had unlocked earlier because it was not courteous to unlock the door in a guest's face. When I came onto the porch, I saw that it was not quite as bad as I had expected. It was not a stranger Helen Clark had with her, but little Mrs. Wright, who had come once before and been more frightened than anyone else. She would not be too much for Constance, but Helen Clark ought not to have brought her without telling me. "Good afternoon, Mary Catherine," Helen Clark said, coming around the car and to the steps. "Isn't this a lovely spring day? How is dear Constance?" "I brought Lucille." She was going to handle it brazenly, as though people brought almost strangers every day to see Constance, and I disliked having to smile at her. "You remember Lucille, right?" she asked me, and poor little Mrs. Wright said in a small voice that she had so wanted to come again. I held the front door open, and they came into the hall. They had not worn coats because it was such a fine day, but Helen Clark had the common sense to delay a minute anyway. "Tell dear Constance we've come," she said to me, and I knew she was giving me time to tell Constance who was here, so I slipped into the drawing room, where Constance sat quietly, and said, "It's Mrs. Wright, the frightened one." Constance smiled. "Kind of a weak first step," she said. "It's going to be fine, Merricat." In the hall, Helen Clark was showing off the staircase to Mrs. Wright, telling the familiar story about the carving and the wood brought from Italy. When I came out of the drawing room, she glanced at me and then said, "This staircase is one of the wonders of the county, Mary Catherine. Shame to keep it hidden from the world." "Lucille?" They moved into the drawing room. Constance was perfectly composed. She rose and smiled and said she was glad to see them. Because Helen Clark was ungraceful by nature, she managed to make the simple act of moving into a room and sitting down a complex ballet for 3 people. Before Constance had quite finished speaking, Helen Clark jostled Mrs. Wright and sent Mrs. Wright sideways like a careening croquet ball off into the far corner of the room, where she sat abruptly and clearly without intention upon a small and uncomfortable chair. Helen Clark made for the sofa where Constance sat, nearly upsetting the tea table, and although there were enough chairs in the room and another sofa, she sat finally uncomfortably close to Constance, who detested having anyone near her but me. "Now," Helen Clark said, spreading, "it's good to see you again. So kind of you to have us heirs," Wright said, leaning forward. "Such a lovely staircase. You look well, Constance. Have you been working in the garden?" I couldn't help it, on a day like this. Constance laughed. She was doing very well. "It's so exciting," she said across to Mrs. Wright. "Perhaps you're a gardener, too? These first, bright days are so exciting for a gardener." She was talking a little too much and a little too fast, but no one noticed it except me. "I do love a garden," Mrs. Wright said in a little burst. "I do so love a garden. How is Julian?" Helen Clark asked before Mrs. Wright had quite finished speaking. "How is old Julian?" "Very well, thank you. He is expecting to join us for a cup of tea this afternoon." "Have you met Julian Blackwood?" Helen Clark asked Mrs. Wright, and Mrs. Wright, shaking her head, began, "I would love to meet him, of course, I have heard so much," and stopped. "He's a touch eccentric," Helen Clark said, smiling at Constance as though it had been a secret until now. I was thinking that if eccentric meant, as the dictionary said it did, deviating from regularity, it was Helen Clark who was far more eccentric than Uncle Julian, with her awkward movements and her unexpected questions, and her bringing strangers here to tea. Uncle Julian lived smoothly, in a perfectly planned pattern, rounded and sleek. She ought not to call people things they're not, I thought, remembering that I was to be kinder to Uncle Julian. "Constance, you've always been one of my closest friends," she was saying now, and I wondered at her. She really could not see how Constance withdrew from such words. "I'm going to give you just a word of advice, and remember, it comes from a friend." I must have known what she was going to say, because I was chilled. All this day had been building up to what Helen Clark was going to say right now. I sat low in my chair and looked hard at Constance, wanting her to get up and run away, wanting her not to hear what was just about to be said, but Helen Clark went on, "It's spring, you're young, you're lovely, you have a right to be happy. Come back into the world." Once, even a month ago when it was still winter, words like that would have made Constance draw back and run away. Now, I saw that she was listening and smiling, although she shook her head. "You've done penance long enough," Helen Clark said. "I would so like to give a little luncheon," Mrs. Wright began. "You've forgotten the milk, I'll get it." I stood up and spoke directly to Constance, and she looked around at me, almost surprised. "Thank you, dear," she said. I went out of the drawing room and into the hall, and started toward the kitchen. This morning, the kitchen had been bright and happy, and now, chilled, I saw that it was dreary. Constance had looked as though suddenly, after all this time of refusing and denying, she had come to see that it might be possible, after all, to go outside. I realized, now, that this was the 3rd time in one day that the subject had been touched, and 3 times makes it real. I could not breathe, I was tied with wire, and my head was huge and going to explode. I ran to the back door and opened it to breathe. I wanted to run. If I could have run to the end of our land and back, I would have been all right, but Constance was alone with them in the drawing room and I had to hurry back. I had to content myself with smashing the milk pitcher which waited on the table. It had been our mother's, and I left the pieces on the floor so Constance would see them. I took down the second-best milk pitcher, which did not match the cups. I was allowed to pour milk, so I filled it and took it to the drawing room. "Do with Mary Catherine?" Constance was saying, and then she turned and smiled at me in the doorway. "Thank you, dear," she said, and glanced at the milk pitcher and at me. "Thank you," she said again, and I put the pitcher down on the tray. "Not too much at first," Helen Clark said. "That would look odd, I grant you. But a call or two on old friends, perhaps a day in the city shopping, no one would recognize you in the city, you know." "A little luncheon?" Mrs. Wright said hopefully. "I'll have to think." Constance made a little, laughing, bewildered gesture, and Helen Clark nodded. "You'll need some clothes," she said. I came from my place in the corner to take a cup of tea from Constance and carry it over to Mrs. Wright, whose hand trembled when she took it. "Thank you, my dear," she said. I could see the tea trembling in the cup. It was only her second visit here, after all. "Sugar?" I asked her. I couldn't help it, and besides, it was polite. "Oh, no," she said. "No, thank you. No sugar." I thought, looking at her, that she had dressed to come here today. Constance and I never wore black, but Mrs. Wright had perhaps thought it was appropriate, and today she wore a plain black dress with a necklace of pearls. She had worn black the other time, too, I recalled, always in good taste, I thought, except in our mother's drawing room. I went back to Constance and took up the plate of rum cakes and brought them to Mrs. Wright. That was not kind either, and she should have had the sandwiches first, but I wanted her to be unhappy, dressed in black in our mother's drawing room. "My sister made these this morning," I said. "Thank you," she said. Her hand hesitated over the plate and then she took a rum cake and set it carefully on the edge of her saucer. I thought that Mrs. Wright was being almost hysterically polite, and I said, "Do take two. Everything my sister cooks is delicious." "No," she said. "Oh, no. Thank you." Helen Clark was eating sandwiches, reaching down past Constance to take one after another. She wouldn't behave like this anywhere else, I thought, only here. She never cares what Constance thinks or I think of her manners, she only supposes we are so very glad to see her. "Go away," I told her in my mind. "Go away, go away." I wondered if Helen Clark saved particular costumes for her visits to our house. This, I could imagine her saying, turning out her closet, "No sense in throwing this away, I can keep it for visiting dear Constance." I began dressing Helen Clark in my mind, putting her in a bathing suit on a snowbank, setting her high in the hard branches of a tree in a dress of flimsy pink ruffles that caught and pulled and tore. She was tangled in the tree and screaming, and I almost laughed. "Why not ask some people here?" Helen Clark was saying to Constance. "A few old friends. There are many people who have wanted to keep in touch with you, Constance dear, a few old friends some evening." "For dinner?" "No," she said, "perhaps not for dinner." "Perhaps not at first." I myself, Mrs. Wright began again. She had set her cup of tea and the little rum cake carefully on the table next to her. "Although why not for dinner?" Helen Clark said. "After all, you have to take the plunge sometime." I was going to have to say something. Constance was not looking at me, but only at Helen Clark. "Why not invite some good people from the village?" I asked loudly. "Good heavens, Mary Catherine," Helen Clark said. "You really startled me." She laughed. "I don't recall that the Blackwoods ever mingled socially with the villagers," she said. "They hate us," I said. I don't listen to their gossip, and I hope you don't. And, Mary Catherine, you know as well as I do that 9/10 of that feeling is nothing but your imagination, and if you'd go halfway to be friendly, there'd never be a word said against you." Good heavens. I grant you there might have been a little feeling once, but on your side it's just been exaggerated out of all proportion. "People will gossip," Mrs. Wright said reassuringly. "I've been saying right along that I was a close friend of the Blackwoods and not the least bit ashamed of it, either. You ought to come to people of your own kind, Constance. They don't talk about us." I wished they would be more amusing, I thought that now Constance was looking a little tired. If they would leave soon, I would brush Constance's hair until she fell asleep. Uncle Julian is coming, I said to Constance. I could hear the soft sound of the wheelchair in the hall, and I got up to open the door. Helen Clark said, "Do you suppose that people would really be afraid to visit here?" And Uncle Julian stopped in the doorway. He had put on his dandyish tie for company at tea, and washed his face until it was pink. "Afraid," he said. "To visit here?" He bowed to Mrs. Wright from his chair, and then to Helen Clark. "Madam," he said, "and Madam." I knew that he could not remember either of their names, or whether he had ever seen them before. "You look well, Julian," Helen Clark said. "Afraid to visit here?" "I apologize for repeating your words, Madam, but I am astonished. My niece, after all, was acquitted of murder. There could be no possible danger in visiting here now." Mrs. Wright made a little convulsive gesture toward her cup of tea and then set her hands firmly in her lap. "It could be said that there is danger everywhere," Uncle Julian said. "Danger of poison, certainly. My niece can tell you of the most unlikely perils, garden plants more deadly than snakes and simple herbs that slash like knives through the lining of your belly, Madam." "My niece, such a lovely garden," Mrs. Wright said earnestly to Constance. "I'm sure I don't know how you do it." Helen Clark said firmly, "Now, that's all been forgotten long ago, Julian. No one ever thinks about it anymore." "Regrettable," Uncle Julian said. "A most fascinating case, one of the few genuine mysteries of our time. Of my time, particularly. My life work," he told Mrs. Wright. "Julian," Helen Clark said quickly. Mrs. Wright seemed mesmerized. "There is such a thing as good taste, Julian." "Taste, Madam? Have you ever tasted arsenic? I assure you that there is one moment of utter incredulity before the mind can accept. A moment ago poor little Mrs. Wright would probably have bitten her tongue out before she mentioned the subject, but now she said, hardly breathing, "You mean you remember?" "Remember." Uncle Julian sighed, shaking his head happily. "Perhaps," he said with eagerness, "perhaps you are not familiar with the story?" "Perhaps I might, Julian," Helen Clark said. "Lucille does not want to hear it. You should be ashamed to ask her." I thought that Mrs. Wright very much did want to hear it, and I looked at Constance just as she glanced at me. We were both very sober, to suit the subject, but I knew she was as full of merriment as I. It was good to hear Uncle Julian, who was so lonely most of the time. And poor Mrs. Wright, tempted at last beyond endurance, was not able to hold it back any longer. She blushed deeply, and faltered, but Uncle Julian was a tempter, and Mrs. Wright's human discipline could not resist forever. "It happened right in this house," she said like a prayer. We were all silent, regarding her courteously, and she whispered, "I do beg your pardon." "Naturally, in this house," Constance said. "In the dining room. We were having dinner." "A family gathering for the evening meal," Uncle Julian said, caressing his words. "Never supposing it was to be our last." "Arsenic in the sugar," Mrs. Wright said, carried away, hopelessly lost to all decorum. "I used that sugar." Uncle Julian shook his finger at her. "I used that sugar myself on my blackberries." Luckily, and he smiled blandly, fate intervened. Some of us, that day, she led inexorably through the gates of death. Some of us, innocent and unsuspecting, took, unwillingly, that one last step to oblivion. Some of us took very little sugar. "I never touch berries," Constance said. She looked directly at Mrs. Wright and said soberly, "I rarely take sugar on anything. Even now." "It counted strongly against her at the trial," Uncle Julian said. "That she used no sugar, I mean. But my niece has never cared for berries. Even as a child it was her custom to refuse berries." "Please," Helen Clark said loudly, "it's outrageous, it really is. I can't bear to hear it talked about." "Constance, Julian, what will Lucille think of you?" "No, really," Mrs. Wright said, lifting her hands. "I won't sit here and listen to another word," Helen Clark said. "Constance must start thinking about the future. This dwelling on the past is not wholesome. The poor darling has suffered enough." "Well, I miss them all, of course," Constance said. Things have been much different with all of them gone, but I'm sure I don't think of myself as suffering. In some ways, Uncle Julian sailed on, a piece of extraordinarily good fortune for me. I am a survivor of the most sensational poisoning case of the century. I have all the newspaper clippings. I knew the victims, the accused, intimately, as only a relative living in the very house could know them. I have exhaustive notes on all that happened. I have never been well since. I said I didn't want to talk about it, Helen Clark said. Uncle Julian stopped. He looked at Helen Clark, and then at Constance. Didn't it really happen? He asked after a minute, fingers at his mouth. Of course it really happened. Constance smiled at him. I had the newspaper clippings, Uncle Julian said uncertainly. I have my notes, he told Helen Clark. I have written down everything. It was a terrible thing. Mrs. Wright was leaning forward earnestly, and Uncle Julian turned to her. Dreadful, he agreed. Frightful, madam. He maneuvered his wheelchair so his back was to Helen Clark. Would you like to view the dining room? He asked. The fatal board? I did not give evidence at the trial, you understand. My health was not equal, then or now, to the rude questions of strangers. He gave a little flick of his head in Helen Clark's direction. I wanted badly to take the witness stand. I flatter myself that I would not have appeared to disadvantage. But of course she was acquitted after all. Certainly she was acquitted, Helen Clark said vehemently. She reached for her huge pocketbook and took it up onto her lap and felt in it for her gloves. No one ever thinks about it anymore. She caught Mrs. Wright's eye and prepared to rise. The dining room. Mrs. Wright said timidly. Just a glance? Madam. Uncle Julian contrived to bow from his wheelchair, and Mrs. Wright hurried to reach the door and open it for him. Directly across the hall, Uncle Julian said, and she followed. I admire a decently curious woman, madam. I could see at once that you were devoured with a passion to view the scene of the tragedy. It happened in this very room, and we still have our dinner in here every night. We could hear him clearly. He was apparently moving around our dining room table, while Mrs. Wright watched him from the doorway. You will perceive that our table is round. It is over large now for the pitiful remnant of our family, but we have been reluctant to disturb what is, after all, a monument of sorts. At one time, a picture of this room would have commanded a large price from any of the newspapers. We were a large family once, you recall, a large and happy family. We had small disagreements, of course. We were not all of us overblessed with patience. I might almost say that there were quarrels. Nothing serious. Husband and wife, brother and sister, did not always see eye to eye. Then why did she? Yes, Uncle Julian said, that is perplexing, is it not? My brother, as head of the family, sat naturally at the head of the table, there, with the windows at his back and the decanter before him. John Blackwood took pride in his table, his family, his position in the world. She never even met him, Helen Clark said. She looked angrily at Constance. I remember your father well. Faces fade away out of memory, I thought. I wondered if I would recognize Mrs. Wright if I saw her in the village. I wondered if Mrs. Wright in the village would walk past me, not seeing. Perhaps Mrs. Wright was so timid that she never looked up at faces at all. Her cup of tea and her little rum cake still sat on the table, untouched. __, I was a good friend of your mother's, Constance. That's why I feel able to speak to you openly, for your own good. Your mother would have wanted, my sister-in-law, who was, madam, a delicate woman. You will have noticed her portrait in the drawing room, and the exquisite line of the jawbone under the skin. A woman born for tragedy, perhaps, although inclined to be a little silly. On her right at this table, myself, younger then, and not an invalid, I have only been helpless since that night. Across from me, the boy Thomas. Did you know I once had a nephew, that my brother had a son? Certainly, you would have read about him. He was 10 years old and possessed many of his father's more forceful traits of character. He used the most sugar, Mrs. Wright said. Alas, Uncle Julian said. Then, on either side of my brother, his daughter Constance and my wife Dorothy, who had done me the honor of casting in her lot with mine, although I do not think that she anticipated anything so severe as arsenic on her blackberries. Another child, my niece Mary Catherine, was not at table. She was in her room, Mrs. Wright said. A great child of 12, sent to bed without her supper. But she need not concern us. I laughed, and Constance said to Helen Clark, Merricat was always in disgrace. I used to go up the back stairs with a tray of dinner for her after my father had left the dining room. She was a wicked, disobedient child, and she smiled at me. An unhealthy environment, Helen Clark said. A child should be punished for wrongdoing, but she should be made to feel that she is still loved. I would never have tolerated the child's wildness. And now we really must. She began to put on her gloves again. Spring lamb roasted, with a mint jelly made from Constance's garden mint. Spring potatoes, new peas, a salad, again from Constance's garden. I remember it perfectly, madam. It is still one of my favorite meals. I have also, of course, made very thorough notes of everything about that meal and, in fact, that entire day. You will see at once how the dinner revolves around my niece. It was early summer, her garden was doing well, the weather was lovely that year, I recall. We have not seen such another summer since, or perhaps I am only getting older. We relied upon Constance for various small delicacies, which only she could provide. I am of course not referring to arsenic. Well, the blackberries were the important part. Mrs. Wright sounded a little hoarse. What a mind you have, madam. So precise, so unerring. I can see that you are going to ask me why she should conceivably have used arsenic. My niece is not capable of such subtlety, and her lawyer luckily said so at the trial. Constance can put her hand upon a bewildering array of deadly substances without ever leaving home. She could feed you a sauce of poison hemlock, a member of the parsley family which produces immediate paralysis and death when eaten. She might have made a marmalade of the lovely thornapple or the baneberry. She might have tossed the salad with Holcus lanatus, called velvet grass, and rich in hydrocyanic acid. I have notes on all these, madam. Deadly nightshade is a relative of the tomato. Would we, any of us, have had the prescience to decline if Constance served it to us, spiced and made into pickle? Or consider just the mushroom family, rich as that is in tradition and deception. We were all fond of mushrooms. My niece makes a mushroom omelette you must taste to believe, madam, and the common death cup. She should not have been doing the cooking, said Mrs. Wright strongly. Well, of course, there is the root of our trouble. Certainly she should not have been doing the cooking. If her intention was to destroy all of us with poison, we would have been blindly unselfish to encourage her to cook under such circumstances. But she was acquitted. Not only of the deed, but of the intention. What was wrong with Mrs. Blackwood doing her own cooking? Please. Uncle Julian's voice had a little shudder in it, and I knew the gesture he was using with it even though he was out of my sight. He would have raised one hand, fingers spread, and he would be smiling at her over his ringers. It was a gallant Uncle Julian gesture. I had seen him use it with Constance. I personally preferred to chance the arsenic, Uncle Julian said. We must go home, Helen Clark said. I don't know what's come over Lucille. I told her before we came not to mention this subject. I am going to put up wild strawberries this year, Constance said to me. I noticed a considerable patch of them near the end of the garden. It's terribly tactless of her, and she's keeping me waiting. The sugar bowl on the sideboard, the heavy silver sugar bowl. It is a family heirloom. My brother prized it highly. You will be wondering about that sugar bowl, I imagine. Is it still in use? You are wondering, has it been cleaned? You may very well ask, was it thoroughly washed? I can reassure you at once. My niece Constance washed it before the doctor or the police had come, and you will allow that it was not a felicitous moment to wash a sugar bowl. The other dishes used at dinner were still on the table, but my niece took the sugar bowl to the kitchen, emptied it, and scrubbed it thoroughly with boiling water. It was a curious act. There was a spider in it, Constance said to the teapot. We used a little rose-covered sugar bowl for the lump sugar for tea. There was a spider in it, she said. That was what she told the police. That was why she washed it. Well, Mrs. Wright said, it does seem as though she might have thought of a better reason. Even if it was a real spider, you don't wash, you just take the spider out. What reason would you have given, madam? Well, I've never killed anybody, so I don't know. I don't know what I'd say. The first thing that came into my head, I suppose. She must have been upset. I assure you the pangs were fearful. You say you have never tasted arsenic? It is not agreeable. I am extremely sorry for all of them. I myself lingered on in great pain for several days. Constance would, I am sure, have demonstrated only the deepest sympathy for me, but by then, of course, she was largely unavailable. They arrested her at once. Mrs. Wright sounded more forceful, almost unwillingly eager. I've always thought, ever since we moved up here, that it would be a wonderful chance to meet you people and really find out what happened, because of course there's always that one question, the one nobody has ever been able to answer. Of course I hardly expected to talk to you about it, but look. There was the sound of a dining room chair being moved. Mrs. Wright had clearly decided to settle down. First, she said, she bought the arsenic. To kill rats, Constance said to the teapot, and then turned and smiled at me. To kill rats, Uncle Julian said. The only other popular use for arsenic is in taxidermy, and my niece could hardly pretend a working knowledge of that subject. She cooked the dinner, she set the table. I confess I am surprised at that woman, Helen Clark said. She seems such a quiet little body. It was Constance who saw them dying around her like flies. I do beg your pardon, and never called a doctor until it was too late. She washed the sugar bowl. There was a spider in it, Constance said. She told the police those people deserved to die. She was excited, madam. Perhaps the remark was misconstrued. My niece is not hard-hearted, besides, she thought at the time that I was among them, and although I deserve to die, we all do we not? I hardly think that my niece is the one to point it out. She told the police that it was all her fault. Now there, Uncle Julian said, I think she made a mistake. It was certainly true that she thought at first that her cooking had caused all this, but in taking full blame, I think that she was overeager. I would have advised her against any such attitude had I been consulted. It smacks of self-pity. But the unanswered question, is why? Why did she do it? Unless we agree that Constance was a homicidal maniac, you have met her, madam. I have what? Oh, my goodness, yes. I completely forgot. I cannot seem to remember that pretty young girl is actually, well, your mass murderer must have? Reason, Mr. Blackwood, even if it is only some perverted, twisted, oh, dear. She is such a charming girl, your niece. I cannot remember when I have taken to anyone as I have to her. But if she is a homicidal maniac, I'm leaving. Helen Clark stood up and slammed her pocketbook emphatically under her arm. Lucille, she said, I am leaving. We have overstayed all limits of decency. It's after 5 o'clock. Mrs. Wright scurried out of the dining room, distraught. I'm so sorry, she said. We were chatting, and I lost track of time. Oh, dear. She ran to her chair to gather up her pocketbook. You haven't even touched your tea, I said, wanting to see her blush. Thank you, she said. She looked down at her teacup and blushed. It was delicious. Uncle Julian stopped his wheelchair in the center of the room and folded his hands happily before him. He looked at Constance and then raised his eyes to gaze on a corner of the ceiling, sober and demure. Julian, goodbye, Helen Clark said shortly. Constance, I'm sorry we stayed so long, it was inexcusable. Lucille? Mrs. Wright looked like a child who knows it is going to be punished, but she had not forgotten her manners. Thank you, she said to Constance, putting her hand out and then taking it back again quickly. I had a very nice time. Goodbye, she said to Uncle Julian. They went into the hall, and I followed, to lock the door after they had gone. Helen Clark started the car before poor Mrs. Wright had quite finished getting herself inside, and the last I heard of Mrs. Wright was a little shriek as the car started down the driveway. I was laughing when I came back into the drawing room, and I went over and kissed Constance. A very nice tea party, I said. That impossible woman. Constance put her head back against the couch and laughed. Ill-bred, pretentious, stupid. Why she keeps coming, I'll never know. She wants to reform you. I took up Mrs. Wright's teacup and her rum cake and brought them over to the tea tray. "Poor little Mrs. Wright," I said. "You were teasing her, Merricat." "A little bit, maybe. I can't help it when people are frightened. I always want to frighten them more." "Constance?" Uncle Julian turned his wheelchair to face her. "How was I?" "Superb, Uncle Julian." Constance stood up and went over to him and touched his old head lightly. "You didn't need your notes at all." "It really happened?" he asked her. "It certainly did. I'll take you into your room and you can look at your newspaper clippings." "I think not right now. It has been a superlative afternoon, but I think I am a little tired. I will rest till dinner." Constance pushed the wheelchair down the hall and I followed with the tea tray. I was allowed to carry dirty dishes but not to wash them, so I set the tray on the kitchen table and watched while Constance stacked the dishes by the sink to wash later, swept up the broken milk pitcher on the floor, and took out the potatoes to start for dinner. Finally, I had to ask her. The thought had been chilling me all afternoon. "Are you going to do what she said?" I asked her. "What Helen Clark said?" She did not pretend not to understand. She stood there looking down at her hands working, and smiled a little. "I don't know," she said.